So for that, Bob, I think we have Marleen back with us, and we're gonna get another go at this.
My pleasure.
Hey, Marleen, I just unmuted you. Are you back with us?
I think I'm back with you. You guys.
Yep. Good to go.
All right, fantastic. I'm just gonna share my desktop there with you again. Okay, great. So I'm gonna start at the beginning because I'm not sure what you missed.
We missed it all.
You missed it all. Oh my gosh. All right. So in South Africa, we received the privacy judgment ruling in September 2018, which determined that adults are allowed to cultivate and consume cannabis in a private space. Following the examples of countries like Spain, Belgium, and the UK, South Africa soon saw the natural formation of social clubs to address gaps in the new judgment, while our government apparently makes use of their 24-month period to amend the existing laws. So in line with our privacy ruling, we decided to call these clubs Dagga Private Clubs, or DPCs. And today I want to talk about the work that we've done in trying to define an acceptable playing field and loose rules to the games of establishing and operating a DPC in South Africa. Fields of Green for All worked hard in collaboration with companies and individuals, amongst others Kenzie Ribule Zemuli, who's a dear friend and an independent researcher whose work you can view and support on Patreon, the European Coalition for Just and Effective Drug Policies, or ENCOD, the International Centre for Ethnobiological Education, Research and Service, and we used many case studies from countries who have implemented this model successfully. And we used this work to try and educate the cannabis community of South Africa on how Dagga Private Clubs would work and what the core integrity of the model is all about, which is enhancing the cannabis community. Initially, the community responded well to this concept, and we soon saw many clubs popping up all over South Africa. However, the problem is that we saw those clubs popping up. And as with any other new venture, the Dagga Private Club model soon expanded to something that didn't align with the foundational principles that we've identified. The integrity of the model was misinterpreted, and it warped into many other things that did not honor the community. The line between non-profit DPCs and for-profit over-the-counter stores became really very blurry. So in order to try and solve this problem, I committed myself to creating legitimate documentation for clubs to implement in order to keep them true and honest about what they are doing and why. And initially this seemed really simple. So I started with documentation like a club constitution, membership and grower agreements and registers, harvest registers, distribution registers, but I soon realized that this was not going to be enough. So one fateful day when I was really very stoned and it was pre-lockdown and the world was still like a semi-normal place, my eyes fell on files that I'd used to compile ISO 9001 QMS system for a previous employer. And I had a random thought that it would probably be really cool if we could have something like that for DPCs in South Africa. So I wasted little time after that, and I soon started using components from the ISO 9001 quality management system. I integrated it with some components from the ISO 14001 environmental management system to create a business and cannabis plant life cycle approach documents for registered non-profit Dagga Private Clubs. Finally, I colored it with the privacy judgment and its related requirements. And now, after almost 1,000 hours and counting of really incessant head scratching, I can present to you the South African National Quality and Operational Standard for Dagga Private Clubs. The aim of this national standard is to provide clubs with a framework to operate as practically as possible, while protecting its community's socio-economic needs and responding adequately to changing conditions that will impact on the operations of the club. It follows the Plan, Do, Check, Act principle adopted from the International Organization for Standardization, meaning that processes and procedures are planned, implemented, monitored, and then improved. This is the content section of the standard. I'm not going to spend much time here, seeing as we'll be going through the document anyway. But some important sections here to note is section 3, 4, and 5, which speaks to the practicalities, the principles and interpretations of DPCs. And then section 8 relates to the planning procedures involved, and section 9 and 10 speaks to membership and grower experience, or the management of the grow. One of the first problems we experienced with the so-called clubs is that they actually followed Fields of Green's for-profit model identified in our manifesto document called hubs. Now, hubs are still illegal in South Africa. We saw franchises being sold for exorbitant amounts of money. We still see clubs undertaking massive advertising campaigns and very little privacy being adhered to. So it therefore made sense to address this pretty sternly and early on in the standard. Much of these problems were also highlighted by NCOD in a press release in 2015, showing that we're not really having a very original problem here in South Africa. And there's some home-hitting quotes in this article, like, "The term cannabis social club is currently being used by many groups throughout Europe. Herewith, we would like to warn against the misuse of this term." And these people have taken the name Cannabis Social Club, but in fact are mostly interested in the possibilities to distribute cannabis in a commercial way. And then finally, the original non-profit and transparent character of the Cannabis Social Clubs is crucial to the success of this effort when convincing media, public opinion, as well as authorities of the rightfulness of this concept. NCOD also has some pretty useful information on the principles that should guide a social club. And according to these, I've identified 4 foundational principles in section 4 that DPCs should adhere to. The first being non-profitability. And this requires the club to reinvest any recorded profits that it may have, either back into the club for the development of the internal community, or donate some or all of those funds towards their charitable cause, which we'll get to later. Secondly, the club needs to be community oriented. So this ensures that the club will focus both on its immediate internal community, which would be the members of the club, and then that collective working together on the external community towards community upliftment. Thirdly would be transparency, which relates to the club's operation, the distribution of cannabis, and its finances towards relevant stakeholders of the club. And then finally, the very popular supply follows demand. And this is a very important factor because clubs need to establish the demand of their community first before they can plan for their supply. These 4 foundational principles will ensure that clubs are started for the right reasons and that the model is being approached as a community enhancement project instead of a loophole to a cannabis supply shop. There are many ways in which a private club could operate while still upholding the integrity of the model. Now, this is probably one of the sections of the standard that will still see the most expansion and refinement in the future. But for now, there's 5 relevant interpretations. The first being an informal club, which has less than 30 members. And as long as there's no further growth for this club, it can remain an unregistered entity, which, however, still needs to comply to sections of the standard relating to planning, membership, and the grower or growing experience. Second is the digital club, which is exactly what the name says, with most of its operations taking place on a digital platform, which is subject to member authentication. So this cannot be viewable by the general public. Then the Caregivers Club aims to cater to the older generation who has discovered that a little bit of cannabis oil or salve or a soap can help relieve their arthritis or joint pain or all the things that come with aging. These products, however, would not be forming part of any formalized medical routine or a medication regimen. So the Caregivers Club would not be subscribing to any medicinal laws or regulations. The venue-based club has a physical location which is only accessible to members, even if it forms part of a public space. And then the Stokvel Club. South Africa's unique approach to community-based saving systems called Stokvel originated from the townships in apartheid times when people of color did not have access to banks. So by pooling their resources together within a close-knit and trusted known group, they act for the good of the group. The same can then be applied to a Dagga Private Club, with them having a grocery stokvel, funeral stokvel, savings stokvel, and then a cannabis stokvel. This interpretation should still comply with subsections which relate to planning, member, and the grower experience. These different interpretations aim to provide to all the socio-economic classes in South Africa, and it really tries to consider the availability of resources when stating documental and procedural requirements for compliance to the standard. It's very important to us to ensure availability, equality, and fairness to all South Africans with an interest in cannabis. There are various factors that form part of the context of the DPC, which would need to be considered in order for the club to ensure that all aspects have been covered and that they can be prepared to respond to any situation that may arrive. The first of this being identifying the stakeholders and determining their impact on the club, their involvement, their requirements, and any other compliance obligations that may arise from this stakeholder. The constitutional framework refers to a system of elements that establishes policies and objectives and creates interactive and interrelated processes to ensure the realization of the said objectives. So this would then include the club's constitution, the policy, the objectives, contextual factors, governing body, planning procedures, member and grower experience management, and structural support, review procedures, general operating procedures, everything with its associated recorded information documentation. And then, of course, one of the biggest contextual factors for DPCs is the privacy ruling, which need to be kept in mind throughout the process of building the constitutional framework. The purpose of Section 6 is to help the club consider everything that might impact on it and that it might impact on. So it should help the club determine who it needs to interact with, how frequently, about what, and when this interaction should be taking place. The governing body of the club refers to the person or persons directing and controlling the club's growth and ensures that compliance to the standard takes place. They could also be the founders of the club or the non-profit company. This body has certain roles and responsibilities towards the club that needs to be identified, and the owners need to take accountability for these obligations. One of these pertain to the formation of a club policy and objective statement, which requires a written commitment to operating the club in line with the standard. Lastly, the governing body needs to ensure that it has identified the positions necessary for the effective implementation and maintenance of the constitutional framework. So Section 7 is there to create accountability with the driving force of the club. They need to commit in writing to building the right type of DPC that upholds the integrity of Dagga Private Clubs in the bigger picture. This will not only ensure that the governing body has the right ideals at the core of its community, but also assure prospective members that they are joining the type of club that one would want to form a part of. Then planning, wow. Managing a DPC requires tons of planning and preparation in order to ensure functionality. Part of this is identifying and managing risks and opportunities. And when you initially start a club, the amount of risks associated with it might be so overwhelming that the club completely misses the equally overwhelming amount of opportunities that are available to it. Section 8.2.1 speaks of the club's operational processes and objectives, and it addresses the identification of operations and growing related operations as determined by the club's interpretation. 8.2.2 then speaks to the cannabis plant's life cycle and ensures that the club identifies every aspect of the cannabis plant's life cycle that is relevant to the club's operations. And the club should also be setting standards for itself when it comes to the cultivation of cannabis. Section 8.3 is pretty important because it speaks about planning for the supply and demand of cannabis. So it details how the club should be determining its demand, and then according to those demand statistics, the club must then determine its supply and plan to provide in the needs of its members. The club should also determine internal and external communication channels and procedures and be very mindful of the sensitivity of the information that they might be communicating about. 8.5 addresses community involvement, which is one that's pretty close to my heart, because for as long as we can remember, stoners has been perceived by society as lazy, unproductive, unhygienic, unmotivated, unsuccessful individuals who do nothing to contribute to society. So section 8.5 speaks to community involvement, and it has a twofold purpose. The first is to ensure that the club is approached as a community enhancement project, as I previously mentioned. So it needs to cater for the needs of its internal community, which would then be its members. The second purpose of this section requires the club to adopt a charitable cause and contribute to this cause with any recorded profits that are not being used to reinvest into the club to further the objectives of the club. Or they could assist this charitable cause in the form of physical labor. So besides this creating a precedent in the cannabis industry to contribute to society, it will also help to change the minds of the general public about who and what stoners actually are. And we'd also like to believe that it would make a judge rethink the classic crook status that stoners seem to have associated with them. Okay, some sections in the standard refer to recorded information, and this is discussed in 8.6. So the constitutional framework has to align with the sections in the standard, and the information contained in the constitutional framework must be similar to the requirements in a formalized QMS system. The aim of standardizing the capturing of information is that this can prove in a court of law that the club was not involved in any dealing or any illegal activities. It would detail exactly where the cannabis consumed by members came from, how it was distributed to members, and it will highlight the club's commitment to the privacy ruling. The documentation will prove that the club makes use of a closed-circuit supply chain and that no cannabis is obtained from or distributed outside of the club. Section 9 speaks to the membership experience, and it aims to ensure that the club registers members, that their needs are effectively managed, and that they sign a membership agreement. You know, a big problem of what we witnessed in South Africa is that clubs wanted to go really big very quickly and have like thousands of members. And it's really difficult to call anything private that has so many people associated with it. So therefore, clubs should be setting a membership limit, and when that amount has been exceeded, they should implement a waiting list system. Section 9.2 ensures that the club is developing the internal community, because they have to attend an orientation session immediately after they sign up as a member. In this orientation session, the club's operations and constitutions and goals will be communicated to the member, but they will also be informed of their human rights as it relates to the cultivation, possession, and consumption of cannabis. And we need to do this because the police in South Africa are not being updated about the current laws as they pertain to cannabis. So therefore, the community needs to be informed so that we can stop the abuse of the police of the cannabis community. The club can also here identify any other important information that it wants to share with the club as part of this session. Section 9.3 requires that members' needs are recorded and managed in line with growers' capabilities. Section 9.4 sets requirements for the management of their personal information. And then Section 9.5 ensures that members are satisfied with the experience by implementing a system to measure member satisfaction. The outputs of this section should be a designed membership experience process, which is based on the inner workings of the club. And this should ensure that members are catered for, educated, and satisfied. So if the needs of members are to be monitored, then the grower's performance must be monitored too. And Section 10.1 requires that a grower is registered in the same way that a member needs to be registered, except that a grower also needs to be willing to meet the expectation of members and the club's requirements as it relates to the standard and the quality of the cannabis that they produce. And these will be discussed also in a grower orientation session, along again with the growers' human rights, especially as it pertains to the cultivation of cannabis. Section 10.1.3 requires that the grower's capability is determined and monitored. The next section requires that the information and intellectual property is managed in a specific way, which speaks to the privacy ruling. And then finally, the last section here requires that growers are effectively managed and evaluated to ensure consistency of supply and the product quality. So every crop that is submitted to the club by a grower should be evaluated. But if the club wants to maintain its own grow, then Section 10.2 must be applied in order to ensure that from a human resource perspective, all bases are covered. So labor requirements and roles need to be assigned, the capability of growers need to be determined and monitored, training needs to be provided as and when required, and finally, again, all crops harvested needs to be going through an evaluation process to ensure that the club meets its own cultivation standards. Section 11 refers to the provision of adequate resources to design and maintain the constitutional framework, adequate competence when employing staff to perform duties for the club, so no lazy stoners here, and then to create awareness of the club's policy and operational requirements amongst its employees. In order to keep the club true to its designed constitutional framework, Section 12 requires the club to track, analyze, and evaluate all their processes by making use of an internal and external review. And then the last section requires the club to make use of a non-conformance and corrective action reporting system so that any root cause analysis can be determined and that we can work towards the prevention of recurrence of such events. Sure, so what a mouthful. My personal vision for this standard has grown from being a usable document to create other usable documents to filling a huge growing gap in the industry. Powered with Fields of Green for All, it is my goal to see this standard being recognized on a national level and contributing to becoming a driving force behind the development and improvement of Dagga Private Clubs in South Africa. The certification and auditing of the implementation of a standard like this would ideally come from the Cannabis Ombudsman, an independent entity which provides separation between law enforcement and the cannabis community. We speak about this body in our manifesto document. So now that the standard has been created, how do we use it? And also, like, when will this thing be actually done? Since I've started with the first page of the standard, I thought that I finished writing this bloody thing more times than I care to admit. So instead of trying to put a timeline on finalizing the document, I realized that it's probably going to keep changing quite frequently, considering the pace at which developments are taking place in the South African cannabis industry. So that's the when. The how. Myself and my dear friend and boss, Myrtle Clark from the famous Dagga couple, also the founder of Fields of Green for All, have formed a sister company called Green Fields for All. As you can see, we are all about the green, we're all about the fields, and we're all about it being for everyone. So we did this to assist prospective and existing DPCs with setting up their clubs from the right perspective and with the aim of upholding the integrity of the model. We'll be partnering with our Fields of Green for All legal team, Schindler's Attorneys, to soon offer a full package to Dagga Private Clubs in South Africa. The South African National Quality and Operational Standard for DPCs will be central to our operations here, and it will form the basis of the work that we do for the community. With this, we hope that we can create a safe community for cannabis consumers all over South Africa, built by people that they know personally. We aim to create a safe environment and safe access to quality cannabis that has been grown responsibly. We frown upon the greedy man who wants to get rich by selling weed legally in the current cannabis construct in South Africa. We frown upon the so-called club who sells weed to anyone and anyone who enters their shop and calls themselves anything but a dealer. We frown upon exploitation of the cannabis community, especially when it happens from within the cannabis community. Dagga Private Clubs will endure beyond any silly regulation that our plant counting obsessed government can think up, and countries like Austria, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, New Zealand, Switzerland, Slovenia, Uruguay, the UK, Spain, they've all proven this, with some of these countries having fully functional cannabis social clubs for more than 10 years. Standardizing Dagga Private Clubs can ensure that the fields are indeed green for all South Africans, and we will not rest until this has been achieved. Thank you very much for your time.